Good evening, students. Next, we are going to see call by value and call by reference. Okay. In the last video itself, we have already seen what is call by value. That is, what are the two methods to pass parameters or arguments to the called function. Okay, by the calling function. The two ways are call by value or pass by value, call by reference or pass by reference. Okay, so let us see first one in detail, call by value. First one is call by value. Okay, call by value in which values of variables are passed by calling function to the called function. Okay, as the name implies, call by value. Okay, in the name itself, look at the term value. As the name implies, this particular method is used to pass the values of variables to the called function by the calling function. Okay, so the calling function is able to pass the values of variables to the called function just by following the first method, call by value. This value is nothing but values of arguments or parameters, okay, accepted by the particular function. So in the call by value method, the called function creates new variables to store the value of arguments passed to it. Actually, the values of arguments or parameters are passed by calling function to the called function. And in case of called function, it creates a new variable to store the values of the arguments passed by the calling function. Okay, so hence the called function uses only a copy of the actual arguments. That is, the values are not directly passed to the called function. Instead, the called function just copies the values of the variables passed by calling function and stores all those values in a new variable created, which is inside the called function definition. Okay, so if the called function modifies the value of parameters, suppose during the execution of called function definition, the value of the parameter is modified. Okay, but the changes in the value of the parameter will not be reflected in the called function, right? It will be reflected only in the called function. It will not be reflected in the calling function. Okay, because the called function uses only the copy of the values passed by the calling function. It doesn't use the original values passed by the calling function. Okay, so in case of called function only, the modification will be reflected. It will not be reflected in the calling function. Okay, so to understand this concept, just consider the following program. Here, we have two functions. The first one, calling function, is main function, and called function is add function. Okay, so here add function is declared outside of all other functions, that is main and add. Okay, so this is what function declaration statement, and this add function is declared of void type. So void type in the sense, this particular add function cannot return any value to the calling function, right? That is what void type. And it takes only one argument of integer type, that is int n. Okay, so next come to the definition of main function. In order to understand the concept of call by value, this main function is defined in such a way that first we display the value of the number before calling the function, and next we display the value of the number after calling the function. Okay, so we have two different output statements in this definition in order to understand the concept of call by value. Okay, so first we declare a variable num, which is initialized to 2. Okay, number equal to 2. And next we display the value of the number before calling the function. Which function? This add function. Okay, so before calling this add function, we display the value of the number. So before calling the function, the value of the number is 2, which is already initialized, right? And next we call the function add of num. This is what function calls statement. And when this statement is executed, the program control automatically continues the execution of the void add function, right? And here what is done? N is equal to add num. Okay, here the value of number is passed to the add function when this particular statement is executed. Okay, so when this function call statement is executed, the value of num is passed to add function. And in this case, the value of the number, that is the original value of the number, is not directly passed to the called function. Instead, this add function takes only the copy of the value, that is number equal to 2. The original value 2 is not passed to add function. Instead, the copy of the value or duplicate of this 2 is passed to the add function. Okay. So here now value n is equal to 2 because this number value is copied into n. Okay. Now n is equal to 2. So what is done inside this definition? N is equal to n plus 10. N plus 10 in the sense 2 plus 10, which is equal to 12. Now n value is modified. That is n is equal to 12. And this modification is going to be reflected only in the called function portion. It is not going to be reflected in the calling function because this particular function doesn't return any value, right? There is no return statement in void add function because this particular function is defined as a void type, right? Therefore, it cannot return any value. Okay, va? அப்ப இப்ப என்னோட value என்ன? It was overwritten. N is equal to 12. Okay. And next we display the value. The value of number in the called function. That is when we are inside the called function, the value of number is equal to 12. Okay. And with this statement, the execution of add function is over. And now the program control returns back to the next statement, which is immediately following the function call statement. And now what is given here? The value of number after calling the function. And just before we have called the function add, and the processing is done here, and the n value is updated to 12. But when we execute this particular statement, here it displays only the previous value, that is number equal to 2. The value of number after calling the function is equal to 2 because this modification is not reflected in the calling function portion. Okay, and next one, return 0. Okay, so this is what the concept of call by value. அப்ப டைரக்டா வேல்யூவை காப்பி பண்றோம். பட் இங்க வந்து வேல்யூ வந்து என்ன ஆகல, ஒரிஜினல் வேல்யூ அப்படி இங்க போகல. இங்க என்ன பண்ணுது, இதோட காப்பியை மட்டும் இந்த ப்ரோக்ராம் எடுக்குது. எடுத்து இங்க மட்டும் மாடிஃபிகேஷன் நடக்குது. And the corresponding modification is not reflected in the calling function. It is reflected only in the called function. இங்க மட்டும்தான் அது தெரியுது. இங்க எதுவுமே வந்து சேஞ்சஸ் இல்லை. So again, even after when we are displaying the value of the number, even after executing the function call statement, it displays only the old value. Okay, because the changed value is not reflected in the calling function. Okay, so this is what call by value concept. Next, come to the output portion. Here, the value of number before calling the function, number equal to 2, and the value of number in the called function. When we are in the definition of called function, the changes are reflected. Therefore, n is equal to 12. 10 plus 2, 12. And value of num after calling the function, that is when we returned back to the calling function, the number value is again equal to 2. It is not changed in the calling function. Okay, because here we did not use any return statement in add function, and we did not create a variable in order to store the value returned by the add function in calling function. Okay. Next, we will see one more example to understand the concept clear. In the above program, the called function was not able to directly modify the value of the argument that was passed to it. In case the value has to be changed, then we may use return statement. So in the previous program, the value modified by the called function is not reflected or is not passed to the calling function, right? Suppose in some cases, we may want to change the value of the variable in both called function as well as in calling function. And in such case, we may use return statement in the called function. And we may use a variable in calling function to store the value returned by the called function. Okay, so to understand this concept, again, consider the same program with the return statement. Now with the return statement. Okay, so here also the function declaration statement, the difference between the function declaration in the last program and this program is the return data type, right? In the previous case, we have declared the same function of void type, and in this case, we declare this function as integer type. Therefore, this particular function will surely return a value. Okay. Next one, main function, that is calling function definition. Number is equal to 2. Again, first we display the value of number before calling the function. Therefore, this particular statement displays the current value of number, that is 2. And next we call the function. In the previous program, we have given only add of num semicolon, and we did not use any variable to store the value returned by the called function. But in this program, we use the same variable num. That is, the value of num is updated here when we call the add function. Okay, so num is equal to add of num. Num value is 2. When we execute this particular statement, the original value 2 is directly passed to add function. Okay. And now n is equal to 2. Okay. N is equal to 2. And inside this definition, n is equal to n plus 10, that is 12. And in this called function, we display the value of the number in the called function, which is equal to 12. Okay, and after the statement, here we have return statement because the add function was declared of integer type, right? So return n in the sense overwritten value of n is 12. And when we execute this return statement in the called function, the value 12 is passed to the calling function and the corresponding value is stored in num. Okay, now after executing this function call statement and this definition, next we display the value of num, that is after calling the function. Now the value of num is updated to 12. Okay, return 0. So if you execute this particular program, we will get the output like the value of number before calling the function 2, the value of number in the called function 12, and the value of number after calling the function, that is in the calling function 12. Okay, so this is what the output of this program. Okay, so now I think you have understood the difference between these two programs, right? In the last one, we did not use any return statement, and in this program, we used return statement. Okay, so this is what the difference between these two programs. Okay, that's all about call by value. Okay, so call by value in the sense the calling function directly passes the values of the variables to the called function. That is what call by value. And what is the second method in order to pass arguments to called function? Call by reference. And it is also known as pass by reference. Okay, call by reference in the sense, in the previous case, we have passed value of the variable. And in this case, we are going to pass the reference of the variables to the called function. Reference in the sense address of memory location. Okay, so the address of the variables are going to be passed to called function by the calling function instead of values. That is what call by value. That we will see in the next video. Thank you.